Germany calling, Germany calling, Germany calling. One would describe as the height of...
William Joyce, better known by his nickname Lord Haw Haw, was an infamous Nazi propagandist who broadcast in English from Berlin for the duration of World War II. His broadcasts, which were recorded, are still available today. Much is known about his capture and punishment. Less is known about his earlier life, which reads like the escapades of a villain in an adventure novel. Joyce was born in New York in 1906. His parents were Irish, and the family returned to Ireland a few years later, settling in County Galway. Some assumed at the time that his betrayal of the Allies was due to Irish republicanism. However, nothing could be further from the truth. Both his parents were from the wealthy landowning class and were fiercely pro-British, an attitude they instilled in their son. During the Irish War of Independence, a teenage Joyce acted as an agent for the British military, passing information on rebel activity. The IRA were aware of his spying and sent down an order that he be assassinated. With the help of his British military handlers, Joyce escaped to England. Under the guise of joining the Worcester Regiment, Joyce enjoyed the safety of Norton Barracks, until it was discovered that he was too young to enlist, and he was discharged. Remaining in England, Joyce attended school, and 2 years later was joined by his parents. He was then accepted into Birkbeck College at the University of London, where he entered the Officer Training Corps. Obtaining a first-class degree in English, Joyce applied for a job at the Foreign Office, but was rejected. He drifted into teaching, and politically, into fascism. A committed colonialist, he believed in the virtue of the British Empire. Stung by the loss of his native Ireland, and incensed by moves to grant more autonomy to other areas of the empire, Joyce believed the establishment was weak, that under their watch, the empire would crumble. But it wasn't until 1932 that he joined Sir Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists. Joyce had a diverse and contrary skill set. He was a gifted orator, but also had a reputation as a fierce brawler. These skills saw him rise quickly, eventually to deputy leader and director of propaganda. However, Joyce and Mosley didn't get along, personally or politically. The BUF was modelled on Mussolini's version of fascism, without the obsession with Jews. Joyce was, and always had been, an anti-Semite. After the 1937 general election, he was fired. As war approached, Joyce was tipped off that he would be interned. This, together with his conversion from fascism to National Socialism, spurred his move from Britain to Germany. On a fraudulently obtained British passport, an act that would come back to haunt him after the war. Joyce's initial period in Germany was spectacularly unsuccessful. He was unknown to the Nazis and found no employment. Then, after a chance meeting with Dorothy Eckersley, a comrade who had also fled Britain, he got an audition at the German Broadcasting Corporation. The Nazis were very impressed by his oratory. His star rose quickly, not least in Britain, where his broadcasts were not illegal, with regular audiences approaching 10 million. Joseph Goebbels was a great admirer, mentioning him often in his diaries and praising his broadcasts. He received civilian awards from Hitler, although the two men never met. But as with the rest of the Nazi regime, the distant drums were moving ever closer. In April 1945, a drunken Joyce made his final broadcast. Within months, he would be arrested and then controversially hanged. A fittingly dramatic end to the life of a most infamous media personality.
Germany calling, Germany calling, Germany calling.
Whilst infamy will always remember William Joyce as the English personification of the Nazis, he was neither the original Lord Haw Haw nor the only English or American broadcaster to serve the propaganda arm of Hitler's Third Reich. The prospect of internment drove many British and English-speaking Nazi sympathizers to Germany in the build-up to the Second World War. Others went there out of fanaticism for Hitler. Some were merely adventurers, caught up in the naive excitement surrounding a rapidly rising power, unaware of the horrific crimes that Hitler had planned. Yet the First Lord Haw Haw was, almost certainly, German. Wolf Mittler was a professional journalist working in German radio, who was roped into the early Nazi propaganda broadcasts to England. A fluent English speaker, courtesy of his Irish-born mother, his Bertie Wooster-style caricature of an Englishman led radio critic Jonah Barrington to refer to that style as Haw Haw. It's not known for certain that it was to him Barrington was referring when the term was coined, but as the preeminent voice for the Germany Calling program, it was likely Mittler that Barrington was hearing, at least in the early days. Unlike the vast majority of the others, Mittler was not a Nazi, nor even particularly political. His lack of enthusiasm led to his replacement on Germany Calling. In 1943, the Nazis became suspicious of his true sympathies. After initially fleeing to Italy, the Gestapo caught up with and arrested him. Managing to escape to Switzerland, he returned to Germany following the war, enjoying an extensive career in German radio and television. This included covering momentous events, providing live translations of John F. Kennedy's speech on the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Apollo 11 moon landing. He lived until 2002, without any stain on his character from the Nazi era. Mittler's replacement on Germany Calling was Norman Bailey Stewart, a former British Army officer who had left the military in disgrace after being convicted of spying for a foreign power. He had fallen for a German woman in 1931. Attempting to gain German citizenship, he recklessly offered to spy for them. After being caught and sentenced to 5 years, he had the distinction of being the last prisoner to be held in the Tower of London. Following his release, the disgraced Bailey Stewart drifted to Austria, where he was originally expelled under suspicion of being a Nazi agent. Hitler's takeover of the country allowed him a route back, and when he critiqued the Germany Calling broadcasts at a party of Nazi sympathizers in Vienna, he was invited to audition for the role himself, which he did successfully. A week before Britain declared war on Germany, he made his first broadcast. Yet Bailey Stewart would be spared the hangman after the war. His broadcasting career was a very short one, followed by non-treasonous translator roles at the German Foreign Ministry that would see him serve just 5 years after the war. He was becoming disillusioned with Nazism. In addition, he was being outshone by his then obscure understudy on Germany Calling, a broadcasting superstar in the making, named William Joyce. Bailey Stewart settled in Dublin and lived a quiet family life until his death from a heart attack in 1966. Dorothy Eckersley, a confirmed Nazi sympathizer who moved to Germany in 1939, was a close friend of Joyce and was directly responsible for bringing the penniless and unemployed drifter into broadcasting after a chance meeting in Berlin. Eckersley was also a broadcaster, providing links and announcements in the English language service. She also brought her son, James Clark, into the business of broadcasting Nazi propaganda. After 1941, following infighting among the broadcasting community, both mother and son were sidelined, but the Germans still regarded James as an asset. In 1944, they attempted to bring James back, but mother and son no longer wanted to participate, and they ended up in an internment camp. After the war, both were charged with treason, but were no longer considered enthusiastic Nazis, especially James, who was thought to be entirely under the influence of his mother. He received a suspended sentence, while his mother only received 12 months. Raymond Davies Hughes was a Welsh RAF airman who made broadcasts after being taken prisoner when forced to bail out of an RAF bomber over Germany in 1943. A complete opportunist, he fell somewhat unwittingly into the clutches of the Nazis. Having been tricked into thinking he was collecting POW information for the Red Cross in the camps, information that was later used in interrogation, he found himself compromised, but was rewarded with special privileges. Upon agreeing to make broadcasts in Welsh to Welsh troops fighting in the Italian campaign, he was moved to Berlin. There, Hughes enjoyed a high degree of freedom, with his own flat and a salary. Sometime in 1944, though, he displeased the Nazis in some way or other, was stripped of his privileges, and sent back to a POW camp. Charged with multiple counts of aiding the enemy after the war, he was found partially guilty and sentenced to 5 years hard labour, reduced to 2 on appeal. Since there was no suggestion that he was ever a Nazi, and was purely in it for his own ends, he returned to society and lived normally until his death in 1999. There's lots more to come in this video, but please consider subscribing. Thank you. A number of Americans also made broadcasts for the Nazis via shortwave radio to the US, both before and after American entry into the war. Frederick Kaltenbach was born in Iowa, the son of a German émigré father. Kaltenbach and his brother happened to be on a cycling tour of Germany when World War I broke out. But despite being detained for a few months on suspicion of spying, his enthusiasm for all things German was undimmed. After several years teaching back home in Iowa, he gained a scholarship to the University of Berlin in 1933, where he became an ardent follower of the Nazis. This didn't go down well when he returned home, and he left for Germany again in 1936. Taking a translator's job for German radio, he soon graduated to broadcasting propaganda. Letters to Iowa, a program in the form of fictional letters home, beginning with the words, "Greetings to my old friend Harry in Iowa," disseminated anti-British, pro-isolation propaganda, discouraging American involvement in European matters. Once America entered the war, his broadcasts became actionable. Knowing this, and feeling disillusioned with Nazism, Kaltenbach's broadcasts diminished greatly. With a treason charge hanging over his head and declining health, near the end of the war he sought to ingratiate himself with anti-Nazi elements, but to no avail. The Soviets arrested him in Berlin, refusing to hand him over to the Americans, and Kaltenbach died in a prisoner of war camp shortly afterwards. Robert Best was a foreign correspondent covering Europe for US media outlets in the interwar period. Based in Vienna, he gradually came to sympathize with Hitler after their occupation of Austria. Having been fired by US publications, he offered his services to the Nazis, but was initially rebuffed. When the US declared war, he was arrested for the purposes of deportation, but this time was able to convince the Nazis to put him behind a microphone, his first broadcast coming on the 10th of April 1942. He broadcast as Mr. Guess Who, with the usual diatribes against Roosevelt, Jews, Churchill and Bolshevism, yet with an unbridled vehemence that made him something of a standout. As defeat loomed for Nazi Germany, he fled Vienna, but left behind documents which identified him as Mr. Guess Who. Captured by the British in January 1946 and handed over to US forces, he was convicted of 12 counts of treason and sentenced to life. He died in prison of a brain hemorrhage on the 16th of December 1952. Douglas Chandler was a Chicago-born former U.S. Navy officer who became a journalist. Ruined in the Wall Street crash of 1929, he moved first to France, then Germany, becoming a reporter for National Geographic. His articles for them led to later criticism that the magazine had been far too favourable to Nazi Germany. Chandler's propaganda broadcasts for German state radio began in April 1941 under the pseudonym Paul Revere. The program began with clattering hooves and Yankee Doodle Dandy, followed by exhortations to the US to stay out of the war and confront the threats of Bolshevism. Dubbed America's Lord Haw Haw for his cultivated voice, he was one of the top earners on German state radio. Following the war, he was arrested, then released by US forces, before finally being tried for treason in 1946. His plea of insanity failed, and his conviction brought with it a sentence of life imprisonment. He served only 16 years, though, being released by President Kennedy on condition that he leave the United States. He was last known to be living quietly in the Canary Islands in the 1970s, and is presumed to have died there. The story of the English-language Nazi propaganda effort on radio is a fascinating one, filled with equally fascinating characters. But as with so many things, in a complex web, with a cast of dozens, or even hundreds, infamy or stardom falls only on the few, or the one. 80 years on, history seems to have forgotten all the others, only remembering the man who was its Johnny-come-lately, its not even original Lord Haw Haw, but its radio superstar, William Joyce.
Germany calling, Germany calling, Germany calling.
While Lord Haw Haw and his fellow travellers were betraying their countries over the airwaves from inside Nazi Germany, occupied France had its own radio superstar, broadcasting on behalf of the Third Reich. Nicknamed the French Goebbels, Philippe Henriot's mesmerizing rhetoric and delivery made him compulsory listening for friends and foes alike, and his career is a timely reminder of the dangers of state propaganda. Henriot's life between the wars didn't immediately suggest that he would become a Nazi collaborator. He was a poet and journalist. The driving force in his life was devotion to Roman Catholicism. Like many Catholics, Henriot felt deeply threatened by the rise of communism. His opposition to the far left led to him becoming politically active in the Republican Federation. The Federation was the largest conservative party during the French Third Republic, France's system of government from 1870 until the country's fall to the Nazis in 1940. The organization gathered together the so-called progressive Orleanists of the right, in opposing the more secular and centrist Democratic Alliance. Henriot was elected to the Third Republic's Chamber of Deputies for the Gironde department, located in southwest France, in 1932 and 1936. As the Spanish Civil War polarized Europe, so Henriot drifted further right. In his speeches, his anti-communism sat alongside increasing hostility to Jews and Freemasons. Whilst this may have suggested that he was by now a fellow traveller of the Nazis, at the outbreak of war, he was fiercely anti-German. As Paris fell, the French government retreated to Vichy in southern France and signed an armistice with the Third Reich. The Vichy regime is often characterized as a puppet Nazi government. However, it was conceived as a pragmatic and expedient way for the French to retain some control over French society. Vichy was a devil's bargain. 2 million French soldiers had been retained as forced labour by the Nazis and held over the head of the Vichy government. French police were forced to round up Jews and communists, many of whom perished. In return, Vichy was largely allowed to plough its own furrow in its own zone and in the French overseas colonies. They also managed to resist committing troops or military support to Axis operations. Henriot began working for the Vichy regime as a journalist, still focusing principally on defending Catholicism. Things changed when the Nazis invaded Soviet Russia. In Henriot's mind, the defeat of Bolshevism would once and for all secure Catholicism against the godless left. He swung squarely behind the Nazis. There's lots more to come in this video, but please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. And please consider supporting my work with a PayPal donation. Thank you. Henriot's work for Vichy consisted of creating programs for and broadcasting on Radio Paris, which promoted the position of the government. He then took to broadcasting twice a day on Radio Vichy, instigating a propaganda campaign against the Free French forces, the resistance within France, and anyone else that he saw as a threat. He also attempted to inspire Catholics in what he regarded as a life-or-death struggle against Bolshevism. His arguments that Nazi occupation wasn't so bad after all managed to find a receptive audience among some, leading him to receive that nickname, the French Goebbels. In 1942, Allied success in North Africa threatened the Vichy regime, forcing the Nazis to extend their military occupation over southern France. Henriot continued to broadcast propaganda. Indeed, his profile and audience continued to grow. Huge and diverse groups of people, some of whom had little time for his opinions, listened in compulsively. At the time, he was probably France's biggest media star. His broadcasts even seemed to fire himself up. In 1943, despite being in his 50s, he joined the Milice, the Vichy government's paramilitary militia. As an iconic figure in Vichy circles, Henriot was always a prime target for the French resistance. Yet such an operation, in the heart of collaborationist France, would be a bold one. On the 28th of June 1944, Henriot opened his door to members of the Milice, except that they were in fact members of the Maquis, the Vichy-based arm of the French resistance, disguised in Milice uniforms. Henriot never stood a chance. What followed might seem odd to a modern audience. Henriot received a state funeral in Paris, presided over by the Archbishop of the city. Thousands attended and filed past his coffin to pay respects. Paris was liberated less than 2 months later, and everyone that day must have known that it was only a matter of when, not if, the Allies would roll into the city. There's no doubt that many saw Henriot as a French patriot, doing what he could to preserve French culture and Catholicism. For others, just like today, Fame and celebrity can have a mesmerizing effect on people, and there will always be professional mourners. What is more unsettling is the realization that in any era, skillful propaganda can blind most people to the moral bankruptcy of tyrants.